The holiday season is in full swing, and for Americans whose paychecks haven't kept pace with inflation, that leaves little money for extras like entertainment, travel, or shopping. Stephanie Sy has more.
'Tis the season for gift giving and cheer, but as the holidays approach, inflation for many Americans is altering how they celebrate. In a recent survey, nearly 70% of Americans said inflation was a concern, and they worried they wouldn't be able to buy as much this year compared to last. For some Americans, increases in prices have had little impact on their finances. For others, inflation is making the holidays harder.
We're buying things now that we might not need, but we know we'll use 6 months, a year down the road because they aren't going to get cheaper later on.
I really have to be conscious about the food prices, what we're buying, where we're going, how much gas we're using.
Overall, I could see the increase in prices, oil, gas, food, medical care. Normally, we would maybe go out a little bit more often, travel a little bit, but right now, we try to limit that a little bit to save on gas cost, anything with dealing with traveling a lot.
It's not just food prices. It's not gas prices. It's not utilities. It's everything all at once.
I have friends that are, especially tradespeople, that are, they, in good times, they were spending $100 a week on gas. And now they're spending, probably $150.
It makes me think about, what do I want to save money for? What do I want to do in the future? How will I help mitigate the impact of inflation?
Christmas came so fast. It's like, what are we going to, okay, well, you want this, you need this. And it's a lot. It's overwhelming at times. And it feels almost as if like there's like a black cloud overhead and you're just afraid of what's going to happen. And you have, the change of spending is worried what's going to happen down the line. Is it going to get worse instead of better?
For more, I'm joined by Neil Irwin, Chief Economic Correspondent at Axios. We just heard from a number of people who are concerned about high prices, but isn't there some data just in the last month showing that we may be seeing a moderation in inflation? Are things getting better?
So there's good news and bad news on that. The truth is inflation does seem to be starting to slow, and there are some good reasons to think it will slow more in 2023, but it's still high, so it hasn't come down yet. Prices, we just got a number this past week, for example, wholesale prices up 7.4% over the last year, and in November, that was 8.1%, so that's improvement, but 7.4% inflation still really, really high. If you're on a budget, if you're trying to make ends meet, that's not great news for American consumers.
All right, I want to get into all of that, but let's take a few steps back and remind us, Neil, how we got into this situation in the first place. Inflation that we have not seen in a generation.
Well, it's a lot of things that converged at once. And the biggest is probably that this pandemic really threw the entire world economy for a loop. You had cutbacks on production during the pandemic. You had a combination of massive stimulus out of the US government and other world governments. You had the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low for a very long time, even as the economy took off. And so all those things together created too much demand, too little supply. So a shortage of lots of different things, of workers, of goods, of shipping capacity, all sorts of things like that, energy, gasoline. On the other side, you have demand that's been stimulated and has been through the roof. The combination of too little supply, too much demand, that's higher prices.
And I do understand that some of the supply chain issues when it comes to just that one factor are starting to be ironed out. But as you say, inflation is still high. The Fed is still worried about that. I want to take just Cyber Monday and Black Friday sales, though, and look at that for a minute, because we did see historic sales on those days. Does that make sense to you, that type of consumer behavior in the face of what we're looking at right now with higher prices?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen from consumers is, yes, they're strained by inflation. They're paying more for groceries, more for gasoline than they were a year ago. But they're dealing with that by using the savings they accumulated during the pandemic. They're spending more money, even despite those hurdles. And as you say, the supply chain stuff has gotten better. So store shelves, inventories look a lot stronger than they did a year ago. So there are goods on the shelves if you want to go buy, and people are taking advantage of those pent-up savings and those stimulus checks from a year ago, things like that, to make it happen.
You know, the other factor, and I know you and your colleagues at Axios have written a lot about this, is this tight labor market. We still have very low unemployment, and the Fed has to grapple with that. That's part of their mandate. So given that you have still high inflation, a tight job market, and you have wages that have increased. Taking all that into account, what's the sort of macroeconomic picture? What is the greater impact of inflation on the economy?
So what's been happening over the last year or so is unemployment's very low. People can get jobs and people are getting raises, but inflation is higher than those raises. So if you got a 5% raise this year, good for you. That sounds great. But when inflation's 8%, that 5% raise doesn't go quite as far and doesn't sound so good. And that's the weird thing about this labor market. We've had extreme labor market tightness, lots of jobs out there, but real wages actually declining, inflation-adjusted wages. The question is, how does that change in 2023? Can we, will the labor market become less hot, but will we see inflation come down enough so that people can actually have greater purchasing power with their paychecks? That's the big open question for next year.
You also have the Fed meeting again next week, and a lot of speculation about whether they will again raise interest rates. I'm sure you're watching that. What specific ramifications would we expect to see if we see yet another interest rate rise?
Yeah, it looks very likely that what the Fed is going to do on Wednesday is raise their target interest rate another 0.5%. We're getting up into the mid to high fours now. That's higher than it's been in many years, really since 2007. So that means money's more expensive, borrowing money's more expensive. That is doing its job. It's slowing the economy. It's slowing growth. It's lowering asset prices. It means the stock market has had a rough year, and the goal is to slow the economy and bring inflation down. So far, the first part has started to happen. The second part, inflation coming down, is not quite as clear.
Okay, so that is also related to all the talk about the big R, the potential for recession in 2024. How are you viewing that in relation to the Fed's decision next week?
Look, the odds of a recession are definitely higher than usual. We could very well find ourselves in a recession in the next few months. Hard to argue we are in one right now. Job growth has remained very strong. Growth seems to be positive. But the idea that we find ourselves in a recession, or at least a soft patch in the economy where there's a somewhat higher unemployment rate, seems more likely than not next year. I think the question is just how severe is that? How widespread is the pain? Whether it's technically a recession or not is not the question. The question is, does this affect the ordinary American in ways that are really painful, or can we get out of this inflationary situation in a more measured kind of way that doesn't hurt so bad?
Well, everyone hopes for the latter, and everyone has that word that you used earlier, weird, when it comes to the current economic picture. Neil Irwin, Chief Economic Correspondent at Axios, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie.